Hello everyone, Mr. Talbot here for you. Wanted to kind of take a little bit of time and go through topics 8.1 and 8.2, going over the Cold War. So, as we think about this, I'm always there's kind of the famous quote from Einstein where people ask him, he's kind of the guy who first thought about the possibility of an atomic bomb. And, kind of asked, well, what do you think the next world war is going to be like? And he says, I don't know what we're going to use in World War III. But what we use in World War IV is going to be stone spears. The idea being that now that we've reached the nuclear age following World War II, we're now in a spot where, the wiping out of the entire human civilization is possible with the weapons that man has invented. Um, and so that's going to kind of be the thing in the background of all this stuff through Unit 8 with the Cold War. All the decisions that we're going to see these different superpowers making all have the potential implication of wiping out mankind. So kind of keep those things in mind as we move forward. So we're in the time period now after World War II. And so we've got the five major allies in World War II. There were others, but these are the five big ones. And they're going to be the five that kind of are going to be very significant through the remainder of the 20th century. So by the end of World War II, without question, the most powerful country on earth is the United States. It's the one whose economy is still in the best shape. While there were a lot of casualties from the military side of things, economically, the war has only been a positive. Big boost in manufacturing, in GDP, in productivity. Our cities weren't bombed in the United States, so that's a big help. Great Britain still has a lot of colonies and stuff at this time, along with France, but they're both in the process of rebuilding. Britain is actually going to move in a very different direction than what it was before. They're going to move big political shift from the Conservative Party over to the Labour Party. So Winston Churchill, despite being beloved in Britain, despite many people still today thinking he's the best prime minister they've ever had, he's actually voted out of office right at the end of World War II. France is in such disarray. The conditions for people in France were so harsh under the Nazi rule that it's and then this is the destruction of Nazi conquest and the fighting back across. Dicey spot where a lot of different potential possibilities for where it goes politically. The Communist Party is actually going to be the most popular party in France after the war. But even the Communist Party only has about 25% support. So you can see multi-partyism, a lot of people being pulled in different directions. China is as soon before World War II and when they're invaded by the Japanese and through World War II, the nationalist Republican people and the communists kind of put aside their differences to fight the Japanese. Well, now that the war's over, the struggle over who's going to rule China is going to be continuing for the next 4 years. And then the other big counterweight to American power is going to be the Soviet Union, the USSR. After this time period, they are going to be able to plunder most of Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany. That's going to help them rebuild their economy. But also, political dissension in the Soviet Union is not going to be okay. So there's going to be millions of political prisoners. They're going to be used essentially as slave laborers to push the Soviet Union forward. We're going to see how they exploit Eastern Europe as well. So this is kind of the five allies. You can kind of see they're all in a little bit different spot following the war. So it's interesting to think that, the two big superpowers out of this is going to be the United States and the USSR, the Soviet Union. And yet they were friends-ish during World War II. At least they had a common enemy in Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. But even before the war is over, they're both kind of doing things to try and put themselves in a better spot for leverage further on down the line. The Allies on the West, with people like Patton, and the U.S. Army is going to kind of block off Denmark from Soviet troops, but they're going to kind of sacrifice Berlin to go to the Soviet Union. A lot of people say President Truman of the United States' decision to drop the atomic bomb was as much meant to end World War II as it was to send a message to the Soviet Union, to Stalin, that we are number one, know your place. So we've got these competing ideologies. The USSR is communist. They're very authoritarian. They have this incredibly big army that has just wiped out the million-man German army on the Eastern Front. Very committed population. They've just shown what they're willing to do to win. And pretty much by this point, everyone's learned you can't really conquer the USSR. They're plundering Eastern Europe like we talked about, and they've now got that slave labor. The United States is doing so well economically, they're going to be able to essentially pay for the rebuilding of Western Europe and Japan and even Western Germany. So a lot of the things that the U.S. has just destroyed, the U.S. is going to pay the rebuild. And that's going to give the U.S. some allies a little bit further on down the road. And again, like I said, the United States has a monopoly on atomic weapons. Only they have them, at least for a little while. And they think it's going to be that way for about 15 years. All right, so what about the other allies? Well, we've talked about the UK and France. They're in the rebuilding process. China has gone through some terrible, terrible experience under the Japanese, but they're going to continue going into a civil war. Going back to Britain real quick, this is a really cool link if you're on the slideshow in Summit. Definitely check that out, kind of seeing, how much of London was destroyed. But as bad as London was, Japan was in way worse shape. We'll see that in a second. And Western Germany and Eastern Germany, for that matter, were in way worse shape from a needing to rebuild standpoint. So as we get into this military standoff, we're going to see both countries don't want a big, war. The U.S. is very aware they cannot just march in and take over the Soviet Union. That's not going to work. The public is not going to put up with that back home. And you're not going to be able to conquer the USSR unless you use nuclear warheads. And if you use nuclear warheads, at what point do you become the evil people to take over, your former ally? So the U.S. Sees Western Europe as kind of its cultural and natural ally. They see it as potential trading partners, and they want to help rebuild them. The Soviet Union, they want a buffer zone between Western Europe and Germany and kind of the Russian homeland. You can kind of get where they're coming from. They've fought 2 world wars with the Germans already. They have a very different ideology than the British and the French. And France, mind you, also had invaded Russia. So 3 times over the last couple hundred years, they've been invaded and suffered tremendously. They want a little buffer zone to keep that from happening again. And we're going to see Germany's going to get split up, and you can kind of see that in the map here between the different allies. And Berlin itself, kind of look closely here, also getting divided up a little bit separately. So the United States is going to have this thing called the Marshall Plan, where they're going to rebuild Western Europe. This is going to help Western Europe get back on its feet, and we're going to see it's going to very quickly surpass Eastern Europe economically. They're also going to be rebuilding Japan. Beyond economically, we're going to see a big uptick in defense spending. A thing called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is formed. And they have a clause that says if one nation is attacked, it's viewed as an attack on all, and everyone's going to kind of come to Russia. It's interesting to think about here, one of the big causes of World War I is entangling alliances. Well, NATO is a very, very entangled alliance. So what kind of sparks this is the Soviet Union is getting kind of aggressive by the late 40s. So they're going to block off Berlin from trucks and goods and stuff. So the Allies respond by airlifting goods in. Now, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do, but they were able to do it. And eventually the Soviet Union's going to back down. But it kind of put people on tense like, man, look, Stalin's willing to fight here. Stalin's willing to do things. So it kind of leads to the creation of NATO. Well, we're going to see soon the Soviet Union's going to make the Warsaw Pact to balance that out. That's going on in Europe. Japan's getting rebuilt. No small feat, we will see. Over 60 cities have been pretty much leveled by the American bombing campaigns. We think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, we forget about all the other cities. The reason Tokyo wasn't bombed with an atomic warhead is because it had already been leveled by more traditional forms of bombing. So Japan's in a really, really big disarray. And you think about, when else in history has the victorious power spent so much to rebuild? But there's kind of a catch that goes with this. The emperor is going to basically have something like, I'm not a divine entity. He's going to be the last emperor of Japan. And it becomes a more democratic system. So the emperor kind of helps usher Japan into its new era. Japan is also going to be forbade from ever kind of rebuilding its military, which means that it's going to be dependent on the U.S. for protection. In particular, today we see that with China, but back then they were also thinking potentially an issue with the Soviet Union. So we talked about, this is no small feat to rebuild Japan. So this graph here kind of shows you in terms of, if it were American cities at the same time that had been leveled, you can kind of see, this would be like if Chicago, Los Angeles, New York City, Miami, Dallas had all been leveled, plus all these other smaller cities. That has to be rebuilt now. And it was the country that destroyed them that's going to end up being the one that helps with the rebuilding. So, here a second, guys.